Last up this morning is Lawrence Leck, also a Trinity engineer, but this time using all this high-tech 3D stuff, which I couldn't possibly explain or understand, that's where we started, but this time to explore new facets and ways of doing art. So, Lawrence, please come up. Thank you.
So I started Trinity 10 years ago, and unfortunately, the month before I came, the World Trade Centers were destroyed, which really kind of put a dampener on my aspirations as an architect, because I started questioning why was this form of space still the kind of main vision for architecture at that point. And throughout my years in Trinity, I started really questioning why, in fact, Utopia isn't what it used to be. Is it because the economy's changed? Is it because our way of representing our ideas and creating a new form of public space has changed? I don't know. There are so many broad questions. But when I was studying here, so much of the kind of emphasis was on historical styles, the language of architecture, the grammar of ornament, and all of these really abstract ideas that to me had nothing to do with the 21st century. And I was a really bad student simply because I thought I knew everything, as I'm sure a lot of students do, especially at Trinity. But I was lucky enough because my director of studies, Nicholas Ray, was really encouraging in me to kind of explore lots of different avenues. And one of the few lecture courses that I went to every single one of was one of his called Architecture and Philosophy. And in that, he talks about how each different kind of space can actually embody a different philosophy, and not just a kind of intellectual construct, but something that's really much more eternal than that. He talked about how some architects and artists were more like idealists, so they had their dreams about public space and platonic solids and so on. Then you had empiricists who are more basically trial and error people and trying to improve. And then you had skeptics who questioned everything. And I was still questioning everything. And after a while, I realized that you kind of have to be all three at once. You have to be able to dream, to fail, and to question without ever stopping, really. And years later, I started thinking, like, what is the kind of starting point of everything? And so it's quite a good place to start 3 billion years ago or whatever. So I started really looking at natural forms and thinking about how you could actually start kind of replicating these, start modeling them, and start kind of being really intuitive in the symbolism that you're trying to create. So instead of borrowing from pre-existing historical references, you start, starting from first principles. One night, I just started, this is a kind of sample of my working process. I basically cut bits of paper up and stick them together. But somehow, the human mind leads to forms being created if you actually really think with your hands. So one night, for some reason, I came up with this shape that's basically these two intersecting wings just with playing cards. And, well, it just kind of emerged. I started from one corner, and it just basically grew towards the other. So obviously, this is a lot to do with natural forms, but it's also something different as well. It's something that's quite artificial at the same time. So I started being interested in how I could actually enlarge this so that actually you would be inside the space itself, and how to integrate different kinds of light and different perspectives and how you would see this form two-dimensionally, like in the shadow behind, and also as a shape in space. For my first exhibition, actually, before this, I called up my friend who was running an art gallery, and I said, I need help to show this somewhere because I have no idea what to do with this. And she put me in touch with a friend who had this space that opened, and it just happened to fit perfectly into the enlarged version of this sculpture that I made, which is suspended on, well, it's not floating, unfortunately. It's suspended on 3 cables from each point as these kind of wings in flight, and you actually walk into the space and out of it again. So it's this idea that it's a kind of externalized body that you then go into once again. I continued with this experiment with making things with my hands and essentially enlarging them in another installation that I did at the Architecture Association in London. It's in Bedford Square. And part of the struggle with these larger scale works, it's about health and safety, but it's also about gravity, really. So for example, I was like, okay, let's just stick all this stuff together. It's actually plywood panels from an exhibition that they had just taken down. So what I wanted to do was actually stitch them all together like a fabric and drape them over, so it's like turning the building inside out. So the final installation was actually kind of like 3 different brush strokes that were bringing the gravity of this structure down onto the ground. And, well, that was interesting. Sorry. So I started thinking about, like, there are these forms that are the thing about art, as I see it, is that when you intellectualize it as a kind of theory or a construct, you're imposing a kind of grammar, a kind of linguistic speech onto a series of forms that actually is a more basic level of understanding than human speech. It comes before speech. So I was looking at the kind of Rorschach test, which is the psychological ink blot test, what do you see in each of these shapes, and seeing if I could actually transform those shapes into a 2-dimensional pattern, which I would then bend with great difficulty and stitch together into a different form of space, essentially. So this pavilion, which I'll come back to again later on, was the first time I actually thought that actually architecture or sculpture can be just about one single person's point of view, a space just large enough for one person, because I personally think that if you can't experience this ideal space as an individual, how can you think that other people will engage with it? I really think that the dream of utopia is great, but it also lends itself to this quite totalitarian state. That's the shadow side of it. So the only way to get away from that is to actually just focus on what you're personally interested in. That was the last series of my kind of plywood explorations. I felt I had come to the end point of bending plywood and cutting up pieces of card. And I started getting invited to do installations at larger galleries and that kind of thing. So instead of trying to basically do the same thing over and over again, I started borrowing from their own collections and kind of showing that work back into the same space. So at the Victoria and Albert Museum, what I did was I kind of did a 3D capture of one of their Buddha heads and actually projected it back on the dome. So it's essentially a very convoluted form of mirroring something back onto the same space that was in. Because in architecture, and many things, there are many kind of plans for amazing projects that never happen. Everything stays on the drawing board. And the thing is, if I were a painter and I was painting on the easel, the work that I was making is the work that I would be showing. It's a representation of something else, but the painting is the object in itself. With design or any project that requires a lot of funding or is a larger scale project, there's so many different ways that it can't that it can't work, that so often the best projects end up speculative. And I think that's a real shame. So I thought, what if the representation of the future project then became the main project itself? So I started making a series of a kind of ongoing project called Bonus Levels. Bonus Levels, it's basically a series of utopian video games that take different extracts of reality or different parts of cities or different parts of buildings and actually put them in a kind of first-person environment in which the viewer can then explore them, just like a first-person shooting game, except without shooting. And it's not really a game because there's no point, and it's actually really boring as a game. But what's interesting is that once you take away high scores, once you take away goals, you're actually left with this you're basically left with this movie camera in which you can explore this whole landscape. It's this non-linear movie in which you kind of make up your own narrative as you go along. So in this case, there were 21 galleries and project spaces across London, and usually they're in like somebody's basement, this train arch, this really crappy warehouse. So I thought if you brought all of these places together, they actually have more critical mass than the V&A or the Tate. They have so much kind of collective energy, but because they're so scattered around, what if you actually brought them all together? So it was no longer the Shard or the Gherkin or whatever, but it's actually all these tiny warehouses brought together. What if they had their own tower? So, and this is one of the spaces in South London. So I made this video game where actually it was all of these spaces stacked on top of each other, and you enter into a lift. You kind of choose which floor you go to, and then it takes you up into that gallery, out of which one is this in an old chapel in Southwark. Developing this idea further, and looking back into Utopia, which, as Thomas More wrote, was an island. Oh, 1 minute left. So I remade Hackney Wick, where the Olympics was, as an island. So we have the different symbols of the Olympics, which are actually quite hard for the public to get to, floating up in the sky. So you have Anish Kapoor's orbit, you have the Velodrome up there, and you have the rest of the landscape down below. And here, I actually started using the same pavilion again, but in this case, it's a teleporter to actually bring you to different places of the site. So it's kind of taking the same symbols and playing with the idea of like what is reality and what real objects can possibly do in this kind of environment. Shiva's Dreaming was a recreation of the Crystal Palace on the night it burnt down on the 30th of November. And it was really looking at this idea of simulated destruction that you get, but how when you're in a safer environment in this virtual world, you can actually play with the idea of danger and kind of dreamlike qualities inside this kind of safe zone. My current project is Skyline, where I'm taking the idea of public infrastructure further. It's literally, I thought of what's the most boring thing in London? It's the tube. So it's actually a tube simulator, but there's certain beautiful things about it. I thought, what if you take everything out except poetry on the underground? So you just go and you read the poems, and that's it. What if London just became about that? So it's this kind of endless landscape through that. And again, just last night, I realized that the pavilion, in a really strange way, it's that. Thank you.
Lawrence, thank you very much. I'm delighted that Lawrence mentioned that problem that all directors of studies have in the first week of term, the students who know everything. And of course, our ambition, I'm sure as you know, Lawrence, by the end of the first week, other universities have induction weeks and all fancy things like that. We just need to get the students to know that it's the dons who know everything at the end of the first week.